All right. I'm going to try to present the disjunctive argument for Catholicism again, this time with the slides. This is, in a way, already a revised or updated version of the disjunctive argument, as I've called it. It's been refined. The core insights have been deepened, I think. I think I can now present the argument in a way that shows a deeper understanding of the principles that are involved in the question of the papacy specifically, because in arguing for Catholicism, it's convenient to argue or to restrict one's arguments to the papacy, true or false, because that can be a decisive issue, because papal infallibility is a unique claim of the Catholic Church. And, the idea of the papacy, Peter and his successors infallibly leading the church, and what that really means is really being divinely protected from ever binding the people of God to error. That's a uniquely Catholic claim. So if you can show that to be true or false, you can show Catholicism to be true or false. This is an argument, though, I've called it a disjunctive argument because it proceeds from an either or. I could also call it an argument from theological imperspicuity or difficulty, the inherent difficulty or lack of clarity in theology, which is relevant to the question of whether Catholicism is true, and what sort of role the papacy serves, and whether we need it in order to be able to find the true church, or sort of the fullness of correct theology reliably. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the slides. I think that for visibility purposes, it's best if I take up the whole screen and then put it on slideshow. So give me just a second to size it. I haven't yet really figured out how to get the slides on here without just display capturing my whole screen. Okay, let me get up here. The slides are a little rough, and they don't all reflect my full current understanding of the argument. If I say something different from the slides, please listen to me, and don't take the slides as the final word. In a certain sense, they're here to help me more than they are to elucidate things for you. But I think by showing the slides, it can still make it easier to follow along with what I'm saying. This presentation is dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Mother Mary, pray for us. Okay. Introduction to the argument, and this is the core of the argument. It's an a priori argument. It proceeds from sort of insights that one could have from the armchair. It doesn't necessarily require you to grapple with the facts on the ground, although when one is discussing the question of which church is the true church, which is the subject of this argument, there's no not engaging with the facts on the ground ultimately in some form or fashion. So I definitely do that, but the idea, the big idea here is that whether Catholicism is true or false, finding the true church can be a matter of just looking at each church and deciding which one has the truest theology for yourself. In a certain sense, the true church is the one that has the most correct theology. So if you just look at each church's theology and decide which one is the most true, that can be a way of finding the true church. That obviously requires you to get into what you might call the raw data of theology, the raw data or facts from the sources of revelation, not all of which may be accepted by all parties to the debate. Some people consider some things inspired, others don't. Some people consider some things trustworthy, like some traditions, and others don't, etc. But there's generally some kind of overlap among all Christians regarding some of the sources of theological revelation. Theology being the study of God, and ecclesiology is the branch of theology that we're doing. The branch of theology that concerns itself with the church, and this is specifically, again, asking the question of which church is the true church. So, obviously, okay, I'm trying to explain why it's a priori argument. People, for very understandable reasons, in trying to settle the question of which church is the true church, are often debating theology amongst each other. And a lot of the time I've found that those debates are not really decisive or fruitful, in rather the same way that when I was a Protestant, for example, I found debates that were based solely on the scripture and whether an idea is biblical or not, to be sort of go nowhere debates, because it felt always like the scripture was a little bit underdetermined. Like, technically, the biblical data can be used to prove any position. You need something else, like a little extra oomph, in order to decide which position should be favored decisively over another. And I've sort of come to feel that in the debate over which church is the true church, what you've got is basically a bunch of cases for different churches, and they all rest on assumptions. And at the end of the day, which argument is going to win will depend on the strength of its assumptions. Or put another way, which argument you find most convincing will depend on which argument's assumptions you happen to buy. And so my hope in using an a priori argument is to sort of, instead of potentially begging the question against another position by assuming premises it doesn't have, I want to kick this debate up to a level of abstraction, to where I can find some common ground, a really sort of deep assumption that everybody would either agree is true, or at least has a high a priori or likelihood of being true, a high prior probability of being true, for intuitive reasons, and then show why this supplies powerful motivation to Catholicism, and will sort of serve as a rational basis for preferring Catholicism, at least until such time as some really decisive case for a different church, or some decisive case for the incoherence of Catholicism, for the falsity of Catholicism, emerges from the theological data. As far as I can tell, there is not one. I have not seen it. But what do I mean by decisive? Obviously, in some sense, I just mean decisive to me. Obviously I could be biased, but I don't think I really am. I think I just want the truth. I wouldn't mind changing. I am Catholic. I wouldn't mind changing my church affiliation tomorrow if I thought it was the true one or taking me closer to the truth. But I mean, even if one does assume that I have not found any sort of non-Catholic case to be decisive, because I'm biased, it doesn't really matter, because one thing we're going to see in this debate is that the field of theology itself, like as a whole, like scripture, has this underdetermined quality. You really don't know for sure what positions can be proven from what data, or ruled out from what data. And we're going to see that's for a number of reasons. And we're going to see what implications that has for whether Catholicism should be preferred as the most rational position, at least on a provisional basis, given the sort of lack of clarity of theology, the so-called imperspicuity of theology. Again, that's why this could be called an argument from theological imperspicuity. Okay, so yeah, you don't get to just assume that Catholicism is true, but you do get to assume that it's either true or not true. The following assumptions are made for the purposes of this presentation, not because they are known to be true, but because if they are not assumed, then the question of which church is Christ's true church runs the risk of becoming irrelevant. So assumption, there is one true religion, and that is Christianity. Assumption, Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. So where it's like we're all agree. This is the debate for the people who all agree on Jesus, and really consider Jesus important, and therefore but they really want to know what the true church is, but they don't know which one it is, and that question can cause people a lot of frustration. And that's something that I personally relate to. So I'm also assuming there's a right and a wrong, or a more true and a less true to theology. If there was no right or wrong to theology, we couldn't really say one church was more true or had a more true theology than any other church. This in turn leads to the assumption that there is one true church that is either all correct or the most correct out of the available options. And even if that's just the one that you invent due to the perceived lack of satisfactory options among those options that currently exist in the ecclesiological landscape. I'm assuming this is something God wants us to do. God wants us to find the true church. If he didn't want us to find it or didn't consider it important, we shouldn't consider it important either if we're faithful. So I'm assuming this is a question that really matters. In other words, it's not spiritually harmful to delve into theology to try to figure out which church is true. And I'm also making another critical assumption. It's kind of subtle, but it's strangely worded. But the way I word it is, if Catholicism is not true, then non-Catholicism is true. And what I mean by that is that, logically speaking, if Catholicism isn't true, it doesn't mean that some non-Catholic church is the true church. But back up and remember that we're assuming Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and that one of his churches is the true, that there is a true church, and one of the churches is the true church. Or how to put it, even if it just exists in potentia, like in your mind, and it's just about to come into being once you, the individual theologian, perceive the unsatisfactoriness of all the presently existing options. So, it's either there, or it's just like on the cusp of being discovered, because there's a certain sense in which even if you don't know everything that's right, if you know that everyone else is wrong, then there's a certain way where you can be at least less wrong than everybody else, at least conceivably. So what I'm saying is, if Catholicism is not true, then non-Catholicism is true. And what that means is that if non-Catholicism is true, let's assume that one of the non-Catholic churches is true instead. If Catholicism is not true, then for our purposes, that means that some other non-Catholic church is true, because one of them is true. Now, if Islam was the real one true religion, then it wouldn't follow from the falsity of Catholicism that, say, Presbyterianism is true. Presbyterianism would also be false. But again, we're not making that assumption. That's what I mean when I say non-Catholicism is true. And so, non-Catholicism is just basically the thesis that Catholicism is false, and one of the other, non-Catholic churches is true. Okay, so moving on, some terminological things. This is language that comes from Bertrand Russell. He found it useful to talk about orders of reference when he was delving into paradoxes of set theory and sets that were stipulated to include themselves. It resulted in weird things like, does the barber who shaves every barber who doesn't shave himself? Because if he does, then he doesn't. If he doesn't, then he does. So there's a certain way you can get your wires crossed. If you don't make distinctions of orders of reference, if you don't make a distinction about between two sets in such a way that this kind of more abstract set is explicitly containing some kind of lower order or less abstract set. So that's what order means in the phrase first order or second order. It refers to orders of reference. So for our purposes, first order theology, by that, it might not be the best term. If I wanted, I could probably present this presentation without it, but I keep lapsing into it. And what I mean by it is sort of positive theology or negative theology, but it's theology that is done on the basis of these sort of raw data from the sources of revelation, the facts on the ground, the concrete givens of theology, in the world that we actually find ourselves in. And, using those, being empirical, trying to use those to decide which church is true, which other church is not true. If you have a debate over the filioque, for example, does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father only or from both the Father and the Son in some sense? Then, you use data, like the writings of the saints or the church fathers. You use the Bible, and you say, these data mean that, the filioque is true or not true. That's an example of first order theology. Second order, a second order, so that would be a first order case for the filioque. Augustine, uses it. Some assumption that Augustine is always right, therefore filioque true. That would be a first order case. Might not convince everybody, but that's an example. Now, second order case is a case that you really can't make without referring to some other argument or arguments in the premises of your second order case. It necessarily makes reference to another case. It doesn't necessarily concern itself with the raw data or the facts on the ground. And so in a way, again, it's a case whose persuasiveness would necessarily depend on whether or not you are persuaded by another case or cases. It's more meta, it's more abstract. Because basically one of the points I'll be making in this argument is that there's not really a decisive, at least, given the difficulty of theology, this is oversimplifying, but given the difficulty of theology, we are at least provisionally entitled to the conclusion that, when it comes to doing first order theology, there's no first order theological case for any church, the Catholic one included, that's really decisive. That yields knowledge of the true church in such a way that, it's like some set of facts where everyone who looks at it and has awareness of those facts and has truly wrapped their minds around them is forced to the same conclusion. I don't know that there's any set of facts like that in theology that's available. Because it seems like people of all different levels of education and it seems like even people with the highest levels of education and intelligence will look at the same set of facts and disagree over what they mean. And there's a certain way where that makes you wonder if just knowledge in the sense of, say, justified true belief is even possible from such a set of facts, which I will later call like a minimal fact set. So I'm going to be making the point that if there's not really any convincing first order cases for theology, then that itself represents if there's not any convincing cases for any non-Catholic church, there could be one for a Catholic church that we just don't know about. But if there's not any for any convincing cases for a non-Catholic church at the first order level, that itself represents a sort of decisive second order case in favor of Catholicism. Because as we will see, the difference between Catholicism and the other churches is that, on the other churches, whether, even assuming Presbyterianism is true, the only way you can find the true church reliably on Presbyterianism's sort of vision of how things work is presumably just by looking at each church and realizing Presbyterianism has the most correct theology. Whereas on Catholicism, if it's true, I suppose you could do that and come to the conclusion that the Catholic Church is true, and probably leave as soon as the Pope says something a year later that doesn't agree with your sort of total theological worldview. But as you can see, I'm getting at the way that approach is probably ultimately antithetical to the spirit of Catholicism, or really any real sincere Christianity. Let me see just a moment. But the critical difference is that if Catholicism is true, then another thing you can do is just be in communion with the Bishop of Rome. That will guarantee you that you're always in the true church, regardless of what happens, whatever doctrinal twists and turns the church takes, based on, say, let's say controversies or councils. Assuming that Catholicism is true. And so basically what that means is, if Catholicism is not true, the only way you can find the true church is through first order theology. But if there's no way to do that reliably through first order theology, that represents some strong motivation to believe that Catholicism is in fact true, regardless of whether or not you can prove Catholicism from first order theology. Now, if it turns out that later there does emerge this decisive first order case, but it happens to favor Catholicism, you will have been justified in sort of having provisionally stuck with Catholicism due to some attitude of skepticism as regards theology at the first order level. So Catholic wouldn't need to fear that. But I am leaving room for the possibility that a decisive first order case for a non-Catholic church could emerge, by which I mean something like a set of facts where truly everybody who is, a set of facts that's articulated at such a level of depth and comprehensiveness that everyone who looks at it, who's intellectually honest, does reach the same conclusion because they're more or less forced to. And obviously there's no, well, maybe not obviously, but there, to my knowledge, there's no such set of facts like that as yet. Some people act as if there is. The only reason why some people act as if the only reason why others come to a different conclusion as to which church is true is just that others are in bad faith. They can't see, or they won't see the simple and obvious truth of Again, just using a stock example, Presbyterianism or independent fundamentalist free will baptism or something. But I don't consider those positions to be very convincing. And I think most grown-ups in this discussion will sort of realize and be a little bit disturbed by the fact that it doesn't seem to matter how smart you are. You can end up on any point of the ecclesiological map, and that also appears to be true, whether based on how holy you are, or how I don't know. If you could say maybe finding the true church depends on being able to sense which church is most beautiful, but even seemingly most aesthetically refined or sensitive individuals still kind of end up in all different churches. So it's just like hard to say what finding the true church comes down to. Whatever rule another thing to keep in mind is that I'm going to be treating this as if this is an academic question, and you might say that's not appropriate, but you have to remember that whatever rule we say is the sort of the rule, or just like the specific clear instruction to find the true church. Even if it's just something like read your Bible and let the Holy Spirit guide you. It has to be a rule such that you're prepared to say, well, someone who didn't end up in my church didn't apply that rule. So if you think finding the true church is a matter of sort of objective academic study, which of course disproportionately favors the intellectually gifted and those who have the time and resources to study, if you're going to say that it doesn't have to be academic study, it comes down to something else, like just being simple and pious, you have to be prepared to say that you're more simple and pious essentially than everybody else who wasn't in your church. Or maybe it comes down to being able to discern which church has the holiest saints. So you choose your church because you think it has the holiest saints, and that doesn't completely claim that you're better at detecting holiness than others. What makes you better at it? It's like because I'm holier. It's like, you're generally holy people don't claim to be holier than everybody else. So there's a method to my madness. It sounds mad to sort of reduce the question of which church is the true church, at least on Catholicism, to which church can be found through like objective, neutral academic study and have the most correct theology. But if we don't do that, it's not really clear that our position is improved as regards getting clarity on what the true church is. At least not for the sort of the grown-ups in the discussion who realize and are troubled by the fact that people of all different levels of intelligence and seeming holiness and piety are just on all different points of the ecclesiological map. All right. So I'm going to move on to really one of the core claims of this argument. I know I've been saying a lot of things that aren't on this slide, but I thought it would just be a good way to give us the lay of the land. So really, one of the big points that I'm going to be trying to make, it's in a way it's an ambitious point, but I think that it's true the longer that I've meditated on this question. And it's something like this, that the only logical alternative to believing something on your own authority, because let's say you're just really good at figuring out the relevant issues, or in the sense that you're really good at figuring out the relevant issues. The only alternative to believing something on your own authority in that sense is believing in it on someone else's authority. Now, of course, if you believe it on someone else's authority, that does presuppose that you are competent to recognize their authority. I do understand that. But if you can sort of make this first order, second order distinction, I can either believe a theory about physics to be true due to my own empirical observation, or I can believe it because a physicist tells me. It's this sort of idea. So in the former case, I believe it based on observation or demonstration. And in the latter case, I believe it based on authority. Now, there's something that non-Catholicism does where when it says that even the highest church authority can err, can be mistaken. As far as I can tell, that just really has disastrous consequences for being able to rest a case on authority, because that even the highest church authority can be wrong, and also really every form of Christianity knows that, recognizes that church councils can get it wrong, so you don't know something just because your bishop said it, or even because the biggest bishop said it. The Bishop of Rome is sort of regarded by everyone, at least until he falls into his first definite theological error, whenever you think that is, as having a primacy, even if only one purely honorary. Still, he's regarded as being the head of the churches in some sense, at least until the point where he falls. And everybody would have looked to the Pope until they decided he was wrong. Everyone would have looked to the Pope as in a sense the leader of the church, Martin Luther, no less than the sort of Eastern patriarchs, or the Oriental Orthodox patriarchs. Even as early as Ephesus, Philip the Legate says it's known in every age that the Bishop of Rome is, preeminent in some sense. I'm just paraphrasing, but there is that sense where he has at least the titular or nominal headship of the church, even if he doesn't have like Vatican I type jurisdiction and scope and like infallibility and everything else. And so, but the problem is that if the primatial leader, that's what I'm going to call him, if the primatial leader can be wrong, and your bishop can be wrong, and councils can be wrong, then if I choose to submit to my bishop because he's my bishop, or to a council because it's a council, then there's going to be a certain extent to which that's always unprincipled. And what I mean by that is, it's unprincipled, like almost like the principle of sufficient reason or something. Like, if you don't have a reason for what you're doing, then there's going to be a certain level of resolution, let's say, where other options exist. And based on the rationale that you have followed in submitting to Bishop A, you could just as easily submit to Bishop B or Bishop C. You don't really have a principled reason for not following somebody else. There's this, and what that means is you're rolling the dice. You are willing essentially to gamble on the question of which church is the true church. But given a sufficiently sort of elevated understanding of the importance of theology, that's not something you should arguably be willing to do. Now, it may be granted that you will not ultimately succeed in figuring out all of theology, but what I'm saying is, if we have a sufficiently high view of theology's importance, you're going to at least try your best. A willingness to gamble on theology is sort of reflecting a low assessment of its importance. And I don't know that we really get to do that with theology because, as far as I can tell, correct me if I'm wrong, but theology either bears on your eternal destination or it doesn't. Or it should be treated as bearing on your eternal destination or should not be so treated. Granted, God's going to have mercy to all, but he's also going to expect you to try your best, no? And so, if it has bearing on your eternal destination, then it's infinitely important, such that, even a tiny difference of theological accuracy between two churches, if one church is just 0.1% more theologically accurate than another, if you multiply that small difference by infinity, which is like the duration of eternity, that even that tiny difference becomes infinitely important. And conversely, if theology has no bearing on your eternal destination, then it's not clear whether within the Christian frame, within the Christian worldview, we should be messing with theology at all. I think that would be the same as to say that theology is not important. So let me see. Here's what I'm getting at. I recognize that you can say, well, even though I don't believe in the Pope, I do submit based on authority. I do submit based on the authority of my church leaders. And let's take Eastern Orthodoxy, because they're an ancient church. They're a church that has apostolic succession, and that they have a high view of the bishop and his authority. So if I'm engaging with an Eastern Orthodox person, and I tell them, well, unless you believe in papal infallibility, you can't really take on anything on authority. They'll be quick to say, that's nonsense. I have a very high view of my bishop's authority, and so on. But this is what I mean. Your belief in their authority either has a rationale or it doesn't. And that rationale, by which I mean it's rooted in your own understanding of theology. You can talk about an upward spiral where it's like, I studied theology a little. It seems like the Eastern Orthodox are always right. The more I study theology, the more I see that they're always right, etc., etc. Of course, though, the nature of theology is such that it's so sort of squishy and quasi subjective that people end up saying this about really any denomination that they end up in, right? I'm using denomination loosely. I know that we're not. Ancient churches have an allergy to that word. I find it very convenient. But I just mean church in a very, abstract sense. But you can do this kind of upward spirals thing, but you should note that to the extent that one's submission to the authority of the Eastern Orthodox is principled there, it is because it's based on authority. It's really based on your own personal understanding of theology. And to the extent that it's not, it's just a willingness to sort of take a shot in the dark, which I don't know if that's I mean, there's a certain way where you might say we're all forced to do that at a certain point, but I mean, it's not really a commendable move, all else equal, just from the standpoint of just as far as accuracy is concerned, or wanting to maximize accuracy. And so really, if I'm getting into it with an Eastern Orthodox person and they say, well, I have a high view of church authority, I'm going to ask why. And then they'll start, demonstrating the theology, the correctness of their theology. And that will be the real basis that they have for trusting in the authority of the Eastern Orthodox, which is another way of saying they're ultimately trusting in their own authority and competence to do theology and discern correct theology from false theology. Now, at this point, I think the most common response to what I'm saying would be that, well, okay, I'll concede this, but I don't see how you as a Catholic are doing anything different. One of the aims of this demonstration will be to try to show that I think I am doing something different. I think I'm doing something very different. And I think that the difference between the Pope and any other bishop is that if papal infallibility is true, then I can have a principled basis for submitting to the Pope that is not rooted in my own perceived competence to judge the theological facts on the ground, but is rather rooted in precisely the opposite, precisely rooted in my assessment that, all I know is that I know nothing, that I'm not really competent to deal with the theological facts on the ground. For if Catholicism were true, then it would mean that in every age there was always a way of finding the true church that didn't rest on one's own personal theological acumen at all. Finding the true church reliably, let's say. By which I mean, critically, if Catholicism is true, communion with the Bishop of Rome will put you in the true church reliably, whether you know that it does, whether you have justification for your true belief that it does or not. In rather the same way that if one pulls the trigger of a loaded gun in good working order, it will fire regardless of whether or not one knows what a gun is or what it does. If Catholicism is true, there will have been in every age a way to find the true church reliably. Let me see. And it won't have rested really at all on your own ability to check the accuracy of the theology of different bishops. It will just rest on your ability to correctly see who the Bishop of Rome is. Now, I know there were periods of historical confusion when we didn't know who the Bishop of Rome was with clarity, because there was, or who the Pope was with clarity, because there was controversy over it. But if one takes the cash value of being in the true church as having true belief in what the correct set of doctrines and practices are, I don't know that the theology of the different contenders for the papacy actually significantly differed from each other in that sense. So even if there was controversy over who the Pope was, I don't think that believers in a Pope would have lost access to the set of true doctrines and true practices as a result, and those periods were also providentially short-lived, from a Catholic standpoint. So so in general, so if Catholicism is true, there's a reliable way to find the true church in a certain sense of the word reliable. And it never rested on your ability to do theology correctly, but just to find out who the Bishop of Rome is, which at most times in history has been relatively easy, including today. But if Catholicism is not true, then the only way you can do it, even if you're submitting to another's authority, is by studying theology. That's the only principled way, at least, that you can submit to authority, which is really just to say that, I've studied theology up to a certain point, and now I'm willing to gamble on the rest, or take a leap of faith. Can be commendable, but again, just from the standpoint of maximizing accuracy, it's not ideal, all other things being equal. And again, assuming a certain attitude of reverence for God and assuming a sufficiently high view of theology, one may want to take very great care with the question of which church is the true church. And I'm hoping to sort of help people who are interested in really getting it right to really see the implications that follow from Catholicism not being true. Because again, Christianity is a deeply pro-authority religion. Slaves, obey your masters, honor the emperor. These things kind of even shock us now a little bit, but you can sort of see why, because, Paul speaks ill of the leader of a synagogue, and when he realizes what he's done, he didn't say, well, you know what, he deserved it because he has the wrong theology. He says, forgive me, because it's written, you shouldn't speak ill of a leader of your people. I think you can sort of understand why this is when you understand the symbolic importance of a leader or an authority in the Christian system, because a leader is always symbolically representing God. There is a certain way that if even the highest church authority can err, it is like negating God for the purposes of your symbolic system. And it really then does rest on one's own individual judgment as regards theology specifically. And not just, as regards the question of whether I'm competent to judge theology, because you can arguably competently tell that you're not competent to judge theology without studying very much theology. That's not a theological question. That's a you question. One which you're arguably qualified to answer. Let me give an example. Let's say somebody's struggling in an advanced physics class and they say that they're confused. And I kind of squint my eyes at them and I say, no, I don't buy that. I don't think you're confused. Like, how can you be confused if you know that you're confused? See that's just weird. That doesn't really work. I would say you must know a lot of physics if you know that you're confused. That doesn't follow at all, right? So you can see that knowing that you're not competent to judge theology is not a theological judgment. But really, if Catholicism is not true, even an attempt to submit to another's authority is going to rest on one's own theological judgment. And you can sort of see why this is just by considering the difference between two hypothetical scenarios, which I'm going to do in a thought experiment later. But in the first scenario, it's a bunch of people trying to figure out the answer to a question. You know that somebody here knows, but you don't know who it is. So you kind of have to fall back to your own judgment in order to find out who it is that knows. Now, in the second case, somebody, it's a bunch of people trying to figure something out. Somebody knows, and you know who it is that knows. And so you know that if you don't know, then you can ask him and he'll know and you'll get the right answer. Now, of course, the wrinkle is when, it's a bunch of people trying to figure something out. And some one person in this group in particular is supposed to know, but you don't know for sure that he actually does, right? But you do know that he either does or he doesn't. And let's assume that you can know that you don't know. Then in that case, assuming it's possible to get the right answer to the question, you know that he does know, that this one person in particular. Whereas if we are strictly inside the case where somebody knows, but we don't have an indication as to who that person is in particular, we're sort of back to trusting our own judgment in a certain way. We could guess at random from the limited set of options, i.e., the limited set of people who are in this situation trying to guess, or one of whom theoretically knows. But so there's points where we can clarify the analogy a little bit more. But I'm just saying, one can see in the abstract there's a very critical difference between, because it may be that every Christian believes, okay, yeah, the true church is going to get everything right, or is going to be at least mostly right, going to be right on all the things that matter. Sure, but you don't know which church is the true church. That's a very different situation from knowing, say, that there's one church leader that is divinely protected from binding his people to error, and then having an indication as to who that leader is in particular. Put another way, if we look at Matthew 16, and we look at the non-Catholic interpretation of it, even if we have a very high view of the indefectibility of the church, in Matthew 16, when Jesus says, Peter, you are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell won't prevail against it. The non-Catholic understanding of what he's saying is something like, Peter, you're a rock. On this rock I'll build my church. And the true church is always going to be the true church. Even though it's not necessarily going to be identified, by what, it's not necessarily going to be identifiable based on the fact that it is headed by your successor or one of the successors of your successor. He's saying basically the true church is always going to be true, but that's also kind of a tautology, because it's like saying the error-free church will always be free of error. But absent any definite indication as to which church that is, it's not very helpful. It's just a sort of tautology again. Whereas if what he's saying is, you're a rock, on this rock I will build my church, that the church that is founded on the rock of Peter and his successors is guaranteed to be free of error, is guaranteed to be true. That's actually useful information that one can act on. The most one can get out of the other interpretation is that sort of there will always be one of the presently existing options that is true or is the most true. But even then, that's not that interpretation. You're not logically forced to make it. You can entertain other possibilities, such as the Protestants entertain when they, thought, well, suppose everybody got it wrong for a bit, but we're about to right the ship right now. I mean, I don't know why that's a priori just absolutely incompatible with Matthew 16. It already seems like whenever we deviate from the Catholic interpretation, to me, we're already in the realm of it being just not particularly useful information to have anyway. Hopefully I've done some kind of job at indicating the stakes and really just letting it be clear that if we don't assume papal infallibility, we really lose the ability to rest an argument on authority or rest belief on authority, and it does become a matter of personal judgment as regards theology, not just personal judgment as far as whether or not you yourself are competent to judge. I get that everybody's making some kind of judgment like that, but I am making the very critical distinction that if papal infallibility is not true, if non-Catholicism is true, let's say, then it falls back on personal judgment, specifically personal judgment as regards first order theology, definite, positive, concrete theology, or else your decision is unprincipled, or else you're saying the way to find the true church is not through theological study. It is rather through being humble and pious, but then you have to be very comfortable saying that everyone in a different church than you is less pious or humble than yourself. You can try to outsource it. You can try to say, well, no, it's because I know that Eastern Orthodox Church has the holiest saints. I'm not one of them, but I know that their saints are holier than everybody else. And then a Catholic comes and says, how do you know that? Is it because you're holier than I am? How do you know? So, you're either going to claim to be holier than thou, or, it's, I don't really know what one could rest one's supposed expertise as regards judging the holiness of, saints. I don't know what you could rest that on other than your own holiness. Anyway, so I'm just trying to give you a sense of the problems that attend on using a different standard than the one which I say necessarily attends on non-Catholicism following its negation of papal infallibility. So let me go into more of what I mean by this. Proverbs 3:6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Now, suppose an atheist like that kind of annoying, 13-year-old atheist looks at this and says, well, it's a dumb proverb because, of course, you got to lean on your own understanding, even if you're just, deciding not to lean on your own understanding. It's like the Rush lyric. If you decide not to decide, you've still made a choice. Oh, boom, Proverbs 3:6 is destroyed, right? This is the thing. Is there a difference between deferring to an authority on every issue in some set of issues just based on their authority, at least where you don't personally understand the rationale for obeying? Is there a difference between doing that and then not deferring to that authority, or not necessarily deferring to that authority on every issue in the set of issues? Like, you reserve the right to disobey. You reserve the right to go your own way on any or all issues, just like if you feel like it, or really like depending on whether or not you yourself understand the authority's rationale, depending on whether or not it makes sense to you, depending on whether or not you agree with it, right? Those are two different things. Now, which one is wiser to do depends on what kind of situation you're in. If you're in a situation where people are out to manipulate you and you really are the smartest guy in the room, it might be smarter to base things on your own judgment, to lean on your own understanding, as Proverbs 3:6 says. But if you're in a situation where you don't know very much, but the authority does, and there's not always time or otherwise good reason for him to explain each and every one of his rulings, it might be, and that you're in a situation like this, it's a good idea to submit to the authority, even where you don't understand, just based on his authority, and not do what seems right to you, which can seem right but actually be very, very wrong, because you're not an expert on the relevant issues. So there's these two different kinds of situations. Proverbs 3:6 doesn't have to be read in a dumb way. It doesn't have to be read in some dumb way where it's saying, well, there's a way to submit that avoids all conceivable charges of self-referential inconsistency. Turns out there's not one. It's like, that's not how it works, right? It's actually saying there's a difference between submitting and not submitting in the senses that I've been talking about, and that you are in a situation where you shouldn't lean on your own understanding but you should rather trust God, because God is omniscient and infinitely wise, and you are not very wise. You should trust God based on his authority and not lean on your own understanding due to your limitations. That's what Proverbs 3:6 is saying. We all recognize that about Proverbs 3:6. But again, one of the contentions of this argument will be that only if papal infallibility is true is the individual to make a not leaning on your own understanding decision, an end decision, and thereby trust in an authority's proper authority, hereafter his authority, when it comes to deciding which church is the true church. Conversely, if papal infallibility is not true, then the individual is forced to make an L decision and trust in one's own understanding, or authority, the authority that one has that stems from one's competence in judging the relevant actual issues. If Catholicism is not true, then the individual is forced to make a lean on your own understanding decision and trust in their own authority, however much they may want to believe in the authority of another individual and may want to outsource all their personal decisions to them and or follow them in every particular. And you're saying, well, wait, it's too fast to say that you get to believe in the authority of the Pope and outsource all of your personal decisions to them. You don't know that. And it's like, that's right. But I do know that I either can do that with him or I can't do that with anyone. And that is useful information to have in the debate, as we will see moving on. So I give a thought experiment here where I'm just trying to explain again that, because initially this move might seem like it's too fast, but it really is true as far as I can tell. Either the Pope is right, or it does all rest on your own understanding of the relevant first order theological issues, not just, the more limited question or the more abstract question of your understanding of whether or not you have good understanding of the relevant issues. So you and 89 other people participating in a reality TV show challenge enter a warehouse full of tools and aircraft parts. You all are told that you each have 1 month to build a new type of aircraft out of a kit, and that this aircraft has to be safe enough for a trained pilot to fly you to Canada in it the week after. The aircraft can only be built in one way for a safe flight to be possible. Each kit comes with an instruction manual, but the manual's obscurity is such that it leaves you and everyone else scratching their head for the most part. Within the warehouse are 10 men, already at work on their own respective models, each with a reputation for expertise in aerodynamics, but each disagreeing on what the final version of the aircraft should look like, with each one's model already looking noticeably different. So, they can't all be experts in the sense of errorless or infallible, because they're not all agreeing. All right, so suppose further that there is a rumor, and suppose that in order to make this aircraft safely, you want it to be errorless, right? Suppose further that there is a rumor that one of these 10 men is guaranteed to produce a safe aircraft because he personally knows the inventor of the aircraft, which inventor is supposedly watching the event from a warehouse camera. The rumor says that the inventor is going to send a wordless message to the 10th man, this special individual, every time the 10th man builds his aircraft wrong in any way, causing a device in the 10th man's pocket to vibrate and only stop vibrating when the 10th man fixes the error. Now, see, what this is trying to get at is that the other 9 men are experts because of what they know. This man or are trustworthy because they are experts. They are trustworthy because of what they know. This man is not necessarily trustworthy because of what he knows, but it's more so because of who he knows / who he is. So there's a certain way in which it's like trusting in his authority, in the sense that when you believe someone on their authority, you believe them because of who they are. And this is somebody and this person in this hypothetical situation is somebody that you would choose to believe because of who he is, rather than what he supposedly knows. You don't know if this rumor is true, but you do know that you can't make heads or tails of the manual yourself. So either the rumor is true, or you'll die by patterning your aircraft after the rumored man's. But you figure imitating the rumored man would be worth the risk, because your chance of dying building the aircraft based on your own shoddy understanding of the manual is equal to, if not greater than, your risk of dying patterning your aircraft after his. You explain your rationale to your friend who is in the reality TV show challenge with you, but he objects. Your rationale has a fallacy. Your rationale says you should follow the 10th man because he is rumored to be an authority. But there are 9 other aeronautics engineers here that could also be considered authorities. I could take your same reasoning and use it as a rationale to obey, for example, the 9th man instead of the 10th. So your decision to follow the 10th man instead of the 9th is totally arbitrary. You might as well face the fact that whether your aircraft flies or falls will ultimately rest on your own understanding of the manual, because the only good reason you could have for choosing the 10th man rather than the 9th would be if the 10th man's aircraft more closely matches your own understanding of what the manual says to do. Okay, let's take a little break here.